Towards the end of the month of April, there has been a major shift in the war in Ukraine, and this shift has been the fact that Russia has finally, albeit gradually, started attacking Ukraine's railroad infrastructure. In addition to this, Russia has also ramped up missile attacks targeting various bridges throughout Ukraine. Although up until now, as of May 7th, Russia still hasn't gone all in into destroying Ukrainian railroads or in destroying various bridges throughout Ukraine. And so far, the vast majority of these attacks have taken place either in the west of Ukraine, near Ukraine's border with Poland and with the other countries of Western and Central Europe, or they have taken place in the southwest of Ukraine, near Ukraine's border with Moldova. And I think that the reason for this is pretty clear. Russia's attacks against Ukraine's railroad infrastructure are meant to prevent the collective West from sending large amounts of military aid to Ukraine. One thing that I feel needs to be said straight away is that these attacks against Ukraine's railroad and transport infrastructure aren't going to completely prevent the West from delivering various weapon systems to Ukraine, but they will severely hamper the collective West's ability to do so, especially when it comes to heavy equipment such as tanks, artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, armored personnel carriers, and perhaps most importantly, the thing that isn't being mentioned pretty much anywhere on the internet, Western supplies of fuel and ammunition. Because at the end of the day, this is what really matters. The West delivering a few tanks, a few artillery systems to Ukraine isn't going to change anything on the strategic level. However, the West delivering large supplies of ammunition and fuel to the Ukrainian military is going to have a strategic effect, since that pretty much nullifies any Russian attempts that have been made up until now to starve the Ukrainian military of supplies. So, at least in my opinion, it is these deliveries of fuel and ammunition that are perhaps the most important aspect in the West's military support of Ukraine. Of course, Western tanks and artillery systems, armored personnel carriers, drones, things of that nature are also not to be overlooked. All of them can inflict some damage onto the Russian military, although it's not going to change anything on the strategic level. But the simple fact is that at the end of the day, if you don't have fuel and if you don't have ammunition, all of these weapons deliveries are absolutely useless. Whereas if you have fuel and ammunition, you can keep fighting even without these weapons deliveries. So with this in mind, I want to start this video by giving a quick recap of Russia's attempts thus far to starve the Ukrainian military of fuel. Throughout the months of March and throughout early April, a large number of attacks have taken place against Ukrainian fuel and ammunition storages, as well as against Ukrainian oil processing facilities. Perhaps the most notable of these was the attack against the Kremenchuk oil processing facility, which, despite operating at only something like 20% of capacity, was still delivering thousands and thousands of tons of fuel to the Ukrainian armed forces every single day. And when Russia attacked this facility in early April, Ukraine lost its largest and at that time its only domestic source of fuel. After the attack against this oil processing facility, a number of fuel shortages throughout the Ukrainian armed forces were seen, but most of these were fairly localized. And at the end of the day, the Ukrainian military still had enough fuel to continue its combat operations, largely due to the fact that large amounts of fuel were now being delivered by train, by railroads from these Western countries. And a large amount of these deliveries entered Ukraine from Moldova, after which they would move through the southwestern parts of Ukraine, through Odessa Oblast, as they made their way into the Donbass and towards the front lines in the Nikolaev region. And in response to these deliveries that went through Moldova, Russia launched several waves of missile attacks against a bridge near the town of Zatoka in the Odessa region of Ukraine. Now, as for the west of Ukraine, Russian missile strikes in this area have been, by and large, targeting Ukrainian traction power substations. Without these power substations, Ukraine's electric trains cannot operate. And although Ukraine still has some diesel locomotives which are able to operate even if all of these traction power substations are destroyed, Ukraine's number of such locomotives is much smaller, on the order of 5 or 6 times less than its number of electric locomotives. Not to mention the fact that these diesel locomotives also won't be able to operate without fuel. By the way, a lot of information that I have received on the destruction of Ukraine's railroad infrastructure, especially in this area, has been from the YouTube channel Defense Politics Asia. Defense Politics Asia gives regular, frequent updates on the events that are happening on the ground in Ukraine and explains in some detail, using maps and visual aids, how all of the fighting is evolving. So I will be linking his channel by a link that will be in the video description. Once again, it's a great channel, gives regular updates as to the situation on the ground, so I recommend that you check it out. Now back to the topic at hand. The destruction of these traction power substations meant that a lot of Ukraine's trains were delayed and were stalled up until these substations could be repaired. And as of right now, Ukraine still has spare power generators with which it can replace the generators that have been destroyed. However, Ukraine's supply of these generators is not infinite. Chances are that sooner rather than later, they are going to run out. At that point, any destroyed traction power substations won't be able to be so easily replaced. And at that point, the vast majority of Ukraine's railroad infrastructure and railroad transportation system will cease working. And at that point, the supply of Western arms deliveries to Ukraine, especially of heavy equipment such as tanks and armored vehicles, will slow down to a trickle. Without a functioning railroad network, all of these vehicles are going to have to get to the front lines on their own power. And this is a distance of somewhere between 700 kilometers if they are headed towards the front line that is in Nikolaev region, and something more like 1,000 kilometers if they are headed all the way to the Donbass. And of course, it is technically possible for all of these vehicles to move this distance on their own power, but that requires fuel. And if we are talking about the heavy infantry fighting vehicles and tanks that Western countries use, for example, the 30-ton Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, the 18-ton Stryker armored personnel carrier, or the 70-ton Abrams and Leopard tanks, all of them are going to require a lot of fuel to get to the front lines, and there is a good chance that at least some of these vehicles will break down along the way. And without the required infrastructure being present in Ukraine to repair all of these damaged armored vehicles, to replace some damaged parts, having a 70-ton tank or a 30-ton infantry fighting vehicle break down in the middle of Ukraine, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away from any nearby logistics base, is going to mean that that vehicle, which has broken down, is for all intents and purposes lost. And of course, this problem extends to the fighting on the front lines as well, because even if these vehicles do manage to reach the front lines, they will still have to maneuver in order to participate in combat operations, and sooner or later they are going to break down. And without the ability to move them back into a friendly base by railroads, they will have to be written off. And of course, if Russia chooses to further escalate its attacks on Ukraine's transport infrastructure by destroying the numerous bridges that are present all throughout Ukraine, starting with the bridges that cross the Dnieper River, which is hundreds of meters wide, then transporting all of these heavy Western vehicles is going to become exponentially more difficult. But for this to happen, Russia will need to make the political decision to start destroying all of Ukraine's bridges that are present everywhere in Ukrainian territory. As I have said earlier, up until now, as of May 7th, this still hasn't been done. However, if we look at the entire timeline from the first days of the war, when there was pretty much no attempt to hamper Ukrainian logistics, to March, when Russia started attacking Ukrainian fuel and ammunition depots but wasn't at the time targeting railroads or bridges, to the second half of April, when bridges and railroads started to become targets, we can clearly see a pattern of Russia slowly and gradually turning up the heat in Ukraine. And if this trend continues, if Russia starts attacking Ukraine's railroad infrastructure and Ukrainian bridges that are in central and in eastern Ukraine, then the transport network within Ukraine is going to collapse. Of course, that would take some time, but at that point, Ukraine as a country will, for all intents and purposes, cease to exist. Instead of having this one unified Ukraine, you would have essentially a collection of city-states and regions operating independently without communication with the rest of Ukraine. So once again, we're a long way from that point, but it seems that things are slowly headed in that direction. So far, we are only at the stage where Ukraine's railroad infrastructure is being destroyed, and this is largely preventing external weapons and fuel supplies from entering Ukraine, which I should mention, in combination with Russia's previous attacks on Ukraine's fuel depots and oil processing facilities, is already starting to have a significant effect, as thousands of gas stations all across Ukraine are shutting down, and those that are still operating are selling gasoline at greatly increased prices and with caps set in place as to how much fuel can be sold to a single individual. But of course, the military is always going to have priority when it comes to fuel supplies over the civilian sector, so this shortage in the civilian sector should only be seen as a precursor to a shortage that is about to hit the military. And like the destruction of Ukraine's railroad infrastructure, this isn't a process that is going to happen overnight. Rather, we are going to see a gradual decrease in Ukraine's ability to transport goods and equipment on its own territory and to deliver supplies to the front lines. This capability is going to keep degrading until sooner or later there will be basically nothing left of Ukraine's transport infrastructure. And at that point, any sort of conventional war, any sort of armed military resistance is going to become impossible. The only fighting that Ukraine will be able to commit to at that point is low-intensity guerrilla war. Anyways, that is at least how I interpret the situation that we are seeing unfold right now in Ukraine. With all of this said, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to hit the like button, since it helps the algorithm recommend this video to more people. And also, please check out my other channels, the links to which will be in the video description. I have a channel on Rumble, and I also have a channel on Telegram where I occasionally make text posts, which allow me to occasionally give small updates and analyses without having to record entire videos. Both Rumble and Telegram are free speech platforms that do not have any political censorship, so that is also a big plus. And if you are watching the video on Rumble, then the links in the video description will be to my YouTube and Telegram channels respectively. So with all of that said, I thank you for watching this video and wish you all a wonderful day.